Buenas tardes. Aunque mi español no alcanza, así que voy a hablar en inglés, pero al menos quería en este bello idioma saludarles y decirles que es un placer y un honor para mí estar con ustedes hoy. As you know, I will be speaking with you about either contracting or expanding consciousness. And I want to start with some fundamentals. First, we humans have a biological capacity of being aware of ourselves and of the world around us. And we have that capacity in 3 dimensions: present, past, and possible future. However, and this is a second basic point that is very important, while there are some individual differences that are biological, whether this awareness is contracted or expanded largely depends on our cultural environment. That is, consciousness is largely shaped by our social environment, by the kind of culture that we live in, that we grow up in, by our families, education, religion, and so on. And a very important thing in shaping consciousness is language, because linguistic psychologists tell us the categories available in a language shape, channel our consciousness. So, I want to quickly illustrate this. Terms like human rights, women's rights, children's rights, racism, sexism, they did not exist in our languages in earlier times. It is very interesting that they had to be invented, coined, created, to really express consciousness about cultural patterns that were just until then perceived as, well, that's just how it is, it's normal, it's natural, and not as human rights violations. Then, as these terms emerged in an interactive process, because as you have gleaned here, in complex living systems, you can't really think of linear causes and effects. You always have to think of feedback loops and interactive processes. The language itself became an instrument for changing consciousness, as I said, in an interactive process where awareness of new possibilities, of new consciousness really, as well as the actions to implement them, spur each other on. Now, we really have to ask some questions now. First, why is it only in recent times that this new consciousness has arisen, and why is it still not shared by millions of people worldwide today? Or why do so many people, including the present President of the United States, deny climate change? You know, we've got these severe storms, we've got, the rising temperature and the extremes of temperature, we've got the scientific consensus, we've even got warnings that we're running out of time. And yet, as far as they're concerned, doesn't exist. And all of this really takes me to what I will be talking with you about, which is my multidisciplinary, cross-cultural, historical study of human cultures going way back into our prehistory to the present, as well as some of the findings, including the new social categories, the new language that was one of the results of this study. And I want to then end with some interventions that are really needed to meet the unprecedented, social, environmental, economic challenges we face. So there is a great deal of information I want to share with you, but I thought I would like to start on a personal note. Because this research and the passion that I have for it came out of my own early life experiences. When by a miracle, my parents and I were able to escape death in Nazi Europe, and by another miracle, we were able to flee to Cuba and then to the United States. And it was there that I learned Spanish, of course, as a child. And I really, these childhood experiences, of course, affected my consciousness. For one thing, so early, experiencing three very different cultures. The European culture that my parents carried with them, the Caribbean culture of Cuba, and then the, again, very different culture of the United States. I became conscious that what people consider just the way things are, that's just how it is, that it's not the same everywhere. And so very early, I became conscious of the importance, of the enormous impact, of the enormous importance, really, of culture affecting what people believe is normal, moral, even possible. And it was also the dislocations and traumas of my early childhood, seeing cruelty and violence, having to leave everything behind, that I, being thrust into poverty in an unfamiliar place. It was these radical changes that eventually led to the question that really underlies my research, and it's a very critical question for our future. The question of what kind of culture supports our human capacities for consciousness, for caring, for creativity, which we today know from neuroscience are wired into our brains, or alternately, because we also have those capacities, obviously, for insensitivity, for cruelty, for destructiveness. And when I embarked on this research, very early it became evident to me that I could not begin to answer this question looking at human societies through the lenses of our conventional cultural and social categories of right-left, religious secular, Eastern Western, because if you really look at the world around us, at our history and our present, societies in every one of these categories have been repressive and violent. And they can be secular Western societies like Nazi Germany, or on the left, Stalin's Soviet Union. They can be secular Eastern societies like Sukarno in Indonesia, or Kim Jong-un right now. They can be, or Pinochet here in Chile. They can be religious societies, like ISIS, like the Taliban, or the rightist fundamentalist alliance in the United States. And it was only as I began, and it was not easy, to leave behind these conventional ways of looking at society, which a colleague of mine calls weapons of mass distraction, because they fragment our consciousness. They don't make it possible for us to see the whole social system. It was only then that I began to see something that it was impossible to see looking through these conventional lenses. And these were patterns, configurations that kept repeating themselves historically and cross-culturally. I could see that despite all of their differences, all the societies I just mentioned, they all really have the same basic underlying social configuration. First, they're authoritarian, but not only in the state, but also in the family. And I want you to pay attention to that, because this work is about interconnections, and it's about making visible aspects of society and of our world that have been obscured in the worldview we have inherited. Second, and again, this is something that we pay very little attention to except as a sort of a marginal, quote, women's issue, they all are characterized by the rigid ranking of the male half of humanity over the female half, and with this, by the devaluation of traits that are stereotypically, because this is not about things inherent in women and men, considered, quote, soft, feminine, like caring, caregiving, non-violence, which are considered inappropriate for real men. And third, and these are all interactive, mutually supportive, components. Third, these societies are all characterized by a high degree of abuse and violence, all the way from child and wife beating in families to the persecution and of minorities to aggressive warfare. But what I also became aware, and this is really very important for our future, for the kind of mental models of what is possible for us as human beings, I also became aware that there is another type of social configuration that has the same core elements, but they're very different. And again, you can find these in foraging societies like the teoría, studied by the University of California anthropologist Stuart Schlegel, in agrarian societies like the Minangkabau of Indonesia, studied by the University of Pennsylvania anthropologist Peggy Sandai, or you can find them fast-forwarding through a very highly technologically type of society. We see this kind of configuration appearing in much more visibly now in societies like Sweden, Finland, Norway. First is a more democratic and egalitarian structure in both the family and the state or tribe. Second is that there is more gender equity. And I want to say something here. We're not talking about we're talking about two sides of a social scale, okay? So we're not talking about, an ideal society here. But you do find much more gender equity, and with it, you find much higher valuing of these so-called soft traits, but not only in women, but also in men, and in social and economic policy, and I'll get back to that. And third, there is less abuse and violence because it doesn't have to be structurally part of the system. It's not needed to impose or maintain these rigid rankings of domination, be it man over man, man over woman, race over race, religion over religion, nation over nation, etc. And there are hierarchies in this configuration. I'll get back to that, but they're very different. But there was no language, absolutely no language to describe this kind of society. So we chose to call one type the domination system and the other one the partnership system. Now, the research that we drew on to identify that identified these two hidden configurations. And why were they hidden? Because there were parts of them that were simply not considered important enough to be included in the social sciences as part of the study of society, a lot of the sources, again, were fairly recent. And this is an interesting thing. And it's a very important thing for us to know, because science is changing. And it has to change. For instance, studies by the anthropologist Donald Fry and other scholars published recently in an Oxford University Press book, they have demonstrated that this whole idea that we have been fed by evolutionary psychologists and social biologists, that we're doomed to violence, to rape, to warfare, by our evolutionary heritage, all the years, the millennia that we lived as foragers. Well, it turns out that if you really bring together, as Douglas Fry did in this Oxford University Press book, a lot of these studies, including his own, it turns out that the evidence does not support that conclusion at all. In fact, if you look at contemporary foraging societies, they're much more peaceful, more gender egalitarian, and yes, they're not these rigid hierarchies of domination. If you re-examine some of the earlier archaeological evidence, as I did together with new archaeological evidence in El Cáliz y la Espada, you also find something very fascinating, because the whole story and how important language is in transmitting stories to us, we live by these, that we've been told about our prehistory, that it's been this linear progression right from savagery to supposedly civilization. That isn't that way at all. It's a non-linear history. And that actually, we have to get over this thing that everything is a straight line too, because it isn't in human systems. But actually, we have archaeological findings that not only for the 99% of our history as our species, were these foraging societies more partnership-oriented, but that actually this lasted well into the first agrarian societies, the first farming societies. For example, in the site of Çatalhöyük in Turkey, which is the largest Neolithic site ever discovered, there are no indications of destruction through warfare for 1,000 years. There, through the graves and the houses, there are no indications of massive, these huge differences in status and in wealth that we see later and we see today, of course. And yes, as the archaeologist who is today excavating Çatalhöyük wrote with some amazement in his article and in his work about it, there are no signs of gender inequality. He was very surprised because that's, so completely built into us, isn't it, that idea? And actually that type of socialization to varying degrees lasted into the about 3,000 years ago in some places, like the Minoan civilization of Crete. And this was already a highly so-called high civilization, very technologically advanced civilization. And of course, we've been told, well, maybe when we were savages and lived in caves, it was better. And the caveman cartoon isn't really how it was. But civilization, that more complex organization, right, requires a domination system. Well, but you wouldn't know any of this, would you? From what is still generally taught in our schools and even in our universities. In fact, if you really look, and this is really fascinating, if you really look at what is taught as, quote, important knowledge and truth, you see a fascinating thing. You see that there's hardly any mention of the female half of humanity or of children. So here you have this fascinating situation where the majority of humanity, women and children, are left out practically of these narratives. And of course, as you've already begun to see, that is true, isn't it, of the social categories we have inherited. Right, left, religious, secular, capitalist, socialist, etc. It just doesn't deal with it. Now, this stunning, really stunning omission of the majority of humanity is our heritage, and I'll just touch on this, of a massive cultural shift that is also evidenced by in archaeological excavation that happened in our prehistory during a period of massive climate and other dislocations. First, we begin to see destruction through warfare. We begin to see radical changes in artistic themes, which are very obvious, because for the first time, we begin to see the idealization of warriors. Very interesting. But it was there all the time, okay? But people weren't looking for that. And of course, yes, we also begin to see the virtual disappearance of the earlier, very numerous female depictions. So we become invisible gradually as the domination system is imposed. And even today, if you really look at what's taught in universities, which have only started in recent years to offer women's studies, men's studies, gender studies, and which still sort of ghettoize not only those studies, but studies about child development. This is not part of the main event, isn't it? But at least it's beginning to be entering into consciousness. And we, of course, then have to realize that it's not very surprising, is it, that it's been hard for us to see the interconnections between how a society structures family and intimate intimate relations on the one hand, and its educational, political, religious, and economic institutions on the other, which is what these new social categories of the domination system and the partnership system make visible. And we couldn't see patterns in history. Pattern recognition, as you heard at some of the earlier talks, is so vital for us. And yet it isn't taught, is it? It's not only that part of the data isn't there, but we don't focus. Yet, when I was last in Chile 25 years ago, I did a number of presentations with my friend Umberto Maturana. The whole concept of autopoiesis, of interconnection, of mutually supporting elements, it still isn't there. But anyway, if you look at modern history, let's just look at it for a moment. And at first it looks random, disconnected. There's this happening and that happening. But if you look at it through the lens now of what I call the partnership domination social scale, you begin to see something very interesting, which is that one progressive social movement after another in the last several hundred years has challenged the same thing, a tradition of domination. Think about it. The Enlightenment, rights of man, so-called man movement, challenged the once considered divinely ordained right of kings to rule over their, quote, subjects. Then the feminist movement came along and said, wait a minute, what about this tradition of domination, which is the supposedly divinely ordained right of men to control, to own, to rule the women and children in the, quote, castles, a military metaphor, of their homes. You look at the abolitionist movement, the anti-colonial movement, the civil rights movement, that's another challenge to a supposedly divinely ordained tradition of domination of a, quote, superior race to rule over inferior ones. And you can just sort of go down the line. If you look at the 19th, 20th century, 21st century peace, a pacifist movement, and then the peace movement, and the much more recent, and this is a very important movement, challenging traditions of violence against women and children, much of it in families. Again, it's a challenge of the use of force to impose these rigid rankings of domination. And the environmental movement, it challenges man's once hallowed, idealized conquest of nature, which could do us in at our level of technological development. So every one of these challenges to traditions of domination has, of course, been fiercely resisted. And yes, there have been periodic regressions. I was born into one, the Nazis. And we're seeing regressions to domination today in many world regions. Now, that's the bad news. The good news, of course, is that there has been movement towards partnership, or we wouldn't be here. I couldn't be talking about this. The European Middle Ages, I would be burnt at the stake for saying this, and you would be burnt at the stake for being here and listening to me, right? So, the Inquisition, the Crusades, the witch burnings, they looked a lot like the Taliban, actually. And St. Augustine really summed it up very beautifully in terms of these rigid hierarchies. He said that for anyone to even question, to even think of questioning their status in life, where they are in life, it would be like a finger wanting to be an eye. Impossible. So the good news, of course, is that we have moved somewhat forward. But I'd like you to think of this movement towards partnership not as linear, but as a spiral upward movement with dips. And we're in a big dip right now. If you look at these movements, and this is really something I would like you to think about, because it will be very surprising to some of you. If you look at them, they have, for the most part, tried to dismantle the top of the domination pyramid, the so-called public sphere, from which, of course, women and children were barred, right? But they've paid far, far less attention on our primary human relations, of traditions of domination, in our primary human relations between the female and male half of humanity and between them and their daughters and sons. Even though we know today from neuroscience that what children experience and observe in their early years profoundly affects how our brains develop, and with it, how we think, feel, act, and yes, what we think is possible, what we think is moral, normal. So we've got to have this interactive model. And what's so ironic is if you look at it from this perspective, you see something, again, very, very obvious, very striking, which is that those pushing us back, they, in their gut, somehow, understand this interconnection. Because whether it was for Khomeini in Iran or for Hitler in Nazi Germany or for Stalin in the Soviet Union or for Pinochet here, big thing is always, or the rightist fundamentalist alliance, right, or not to speak of the Taliban or ISIS, get women back into their, quote, traditional place, right? Well, that's a code word, isn't it? For a subservient place in a very authoritarian, highly punitive family, where children learn early on that it is very painful to question authority, no matter how brutal, no matter how absurd, okay? So I found in studying these psychosocial dynamics that the people who have pushed us back in the United States, the rightist fundamentalist corporate alliance, if you really think about it, they have paid enormous attention to this, enormous energy, enormous resources. they have paid total attention to 4 cornerstones that we really have to start paying attention to if we are to move forward and not have another regression which, well, it could take us, as I said, to an evolutionary dead end. First of all, family, the first cornerstone is family and childhood relations. They appropriated and distorted, didn't they? Family, values, morality. The second cornerstone is gender. They demonized gender partnership. The third cornerstone, economics. You know, the trickle-down, top-down economics, that's just how it is, you know? You content yourself with the scraps dropping from the opulent tables of those on top. And fourth, narratives. For example, one of their favorite narratives is that the only good family is one in which the father is, quote, master of the house. And as you're beginning to glimpse, there's a reason for that, isn't there? Because there is a direct correlation between those early experiences and perceptions of what is normal, moral, between an authoritarian family and strongman rule in the state or tribe. So these are connections, these are patterns, and I want to really end my talk with looking at these 4 cornerstones in terms of what we can do to stop these regressions. Because if we don't focus on these same 4 cornerstones, we're not going to have the foundations to really have the kind of world that we want. The first cornerstone, as I said, is family and childhood relations. And of course, neuroscience shows that the neural pathways of our brains are not set at birth. They're largely formed in interaction with a child's early experiences and observation. While people can and do change throughout life, early experiences and relations are crucial. So we've got to, and we've got the resources here to really move this to the partnership side of the social scale. We have excellent materials, for example, on authoritative rather than authoritarian parenting, including the Caring and Connected Parenting Guide that we offer at the Center for Partnership Studies in Spanish as well. But it isn't that, if you look at human rights violations, the extent of human rights violations worldwide against women and children is horrific. And most of it happens within families. So we need not only better laws and enforcement of laws, but we need something else. We need our spiritual leaders, and that's up to you whether it happens or not, to really take a strong stand against this intimate violence, not only for the sake of the millions and millions whose lives are taken or blighted by it, but for the sake of us all. Because as long as that violence continues, what children learn is that it is okay to use violence to impose your will on others. And of course, the violence is also against women, which takes me to the second cornerstone, which is gender relations. And as we began to see, how a society constructs these relations is not only a matter of our individual life options as women and men, but it profoundly affects and interconnects with the whole social system. One reason is that if children learn to equate difference, beginning with that fundamental difference between the form of male and female, they have a template, if it's going to be superior, inferior, it's equated with dominating or being dominated, with being served or serving, hardly a model for economic equity, right? They have this template, don't they, for all differences, racial, religious, ethnic, sexual orientation, you name it. But there's much more, because as you have also begun to glimpse, we have inherited a gendered system of values. A gendered system of values. And we all have carried this, not only men, but women. And children are still taught it, in which anything that is stereotypically, again, nothing inherent in women and men, considered, quote, feminine, associated with women, is given less value, less value. caring, caregiving, nonviolence. So the interesting thing is how crazy that is, because there is actually empirical evidence today. Again, you would never know this by looking at your economic studies that are being taught generally in universities yet, that shows that the status of women is a powerful predictor of general quality of life. We did a pioneering such study called Women, Men, and the Global Quality of Life, drawing from statistical data of 89 nations, but you see it since then in the global gender gap reports of the World Economic Forums, and how the nations such as Sweden, Finland, Norway that rank low in the gender gap actually are always high in the global competitiveness reports. So it is really an interesting correlation, isn't it, in terms of not only quality of life, but economic success. So we urgently need a whole new way of thinking of economics, which takes me quickly to the third cornerstone. And this, of course, is economics. We obviously, in light of what I've been talking to you, but in light of what we see all around us, we need a whole new economic paradigm. Certainly, this whole argument always between capitalism and socialism is again a distraction. Because consider that both capitalist and socialist theory came out of early industrial times, the 1700s, the 1800s, and we're today well into the 21st century post-industrial era. So they're antiquated. But the problem is deeper, because they came out of times that really oriented more to the domination side, and both perpetuate top-down economics. If you, as I said, think about trickle-down economics, it's like in feudal times, right? You were supposed to, it's okay, you just get the scraps dropping from the opulent tables of those on tops. So what we're dealing with is really not capitalism, it's one more version of domination economics, be it feudal, be it tribal, be it a mercantilist, be it Eastern, be it